Hi everybody, this is Nonduality Talk. I'm Jerry Katz. This interview is taking place on December 29th, 2014. My guest is Ivan Granger. Ivan's a poet, a modern mystic. He's founder and editor of Poetry Chaikhana, which is a publishing house and an online resource of sacred poetry. I've known about Ivan's work for years. Ivan selects and presents the highest quality of sacred poetry from diverse times, eras, and civilizations. I want to find out about Ivan and the poetry that's most revealing to him and why. Hi, Ivan. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Jerry. It's a real pleasure to be here. And let me just say also that I've been a longtime fan of your work, and I've been aware of your work through things like Nonduality Highlights newsletter, which you did for quite a while, and of course these radio interviews and podcasts. I've really enjoyed them for years.
Thank you. We want to talk about your book, The Longing in Between. And let me also give your website, which is poetrychaikhana.com. It's poetry-chaikhana, Chaikhana. And I like to ask people about their life. And Ivan, I read your book, The Longing in Between. You don't really, you don't talk about your life all in one place, but it's kind of scattered.
Yes, that's really been an evolving but intentional approach. I didn't feel like I created the Poetry Chaikhana as a way to shine the spotlight directly on myself. It really was first and foremost about bringing this amazing poetry to a wider audience. However, at the same time, I felt like there's a lot of this poetry that is getting published and circulated in various books and websites, but where there isn't a lot of commentary, a lot of exploration of what may have been meant or ways of reading it from a more esoteric or mystic's point of view. And so to do that in a very honest and personable way, I often will bring in my own experiences from my own life, my own perspectives. I try to make it clear that these are my own perspectives and not the absolute one and only way to understand these poems. But I feel like there's a problem where a lot of this poetry tends to exist. If you can find it at all, it tends to exist in a vacuum. Or if you do get some sort of discussion or commentary, it's rather academic. And it doesn't, in my opinion, often get to the real heart of what these great visionary people were attempting to communicate. So I try to bring a very personal and mystic's point of view to it. So I try to avoid that rather aloof academic approach and try to make it very conversational when I'm discussing it. I try to discuss really a relationship to the sort of poetry I share with people. So I'll discuss my relationship with a poem. I'll talk about what it makes me think about, feel, what it reminds me of my own personal spiritual journey and experiences and exploration, and hope that in doing that, it will inspire a much more personal and less intellectual relationship in the audience who is discovering this poetry for the first time.
And you describe your commentary in your book, you say it's conversational and idiosyncratic. And so it's refreshing in that sense. I think what a person is hearing is not just you, but really they're hearing themselves, what they feel about it, what they already kind of know and sense and intuit about it.
Yeah, yes, it is.
And that's for people that are familiar with that poetry. For people who aren't familiar with it, through your book, they can discover it. They can discover the best sacred poetry and a commentary from like an ordinary guy that you can be sitting in a restaurant with, in a bar with, at the kitchen table with. You say it in an ordinary way, conversational. What do you mean by idiosyncratic?
I feel like when I am writing down this commentary, I do feel like I'm sitting down and having a conversation with someone. And so I feel in many ways there's a dialogue going on. And I very much want it to be on that more immediate social level. Again, I've felt a lot of frustration in the past when I've first encountered a lot of this wonderful poetry and tried to figure out, well, what are they talking about? What are they saying? Why are they using this imagery or this metaphor, this sort of language? And you can find out a certain amount by reading some of the material out there. But again, it has this rather intellectual quality where people tend to analyze it within a historical context, maybe within a religious context, which is all extremely valuable. But to me, it still feels rather dry. It's a way of keeping a lot of this material caught in the head and in the intellect. And I view a lot of this poetry as being a very alchemical sort of thing. It's an utterance of some immensely personal experience of the divine or of wide open awareness. And it's not meant to be critically analyzed in the intellect exclusively. It's meant to somehow plant a seed in the listener or the reader that starts to work its own strange magic on the awareness. And so it requires a much more, it requires a sort of a connection to this poetry and an exploration of this poetry that gets out of strictly an intellectual view of it. We need to feel it in our gut. It needs to be very visceral. And we need to just have some doorway into whatever this potent thing is that many of these poets are exploring and conveying and sometimes teasing us with their language about. We need to find ways out of the intellect and still begin to try to understand it, but in a more holistic and immediate way. And so for that reason, I may have little elements that are about, who this individual was and what they were trying to say that satisfy kind of that intellectual curiosity that is also important. But I try to cultivate a very personal conversational style that then invites other readers to kind of have that, what I'm calling an alchemical relationship to this poetry. So the poetry can kind of take root in the consciousness and just start to do its own magical work on that awareness over time.
A good question to ask is, what makes a poem sacred? Would you address that? And also, how about reading something?
A little poetry here. Okay, let's see here. Well, first of all, let me just jump in to address your question about what is sacred poetry, what makes a poem sacred, because that really is pretty much at the core of a lot of the work I do with the Poetry Chaikhana. Because I've had people come up to me and say, well, isn't all poetry essentially sacred poetry? And my simple answer is, yes, I agree that all poetry on some level is recognizing a resonance beneath or within our daily experiences. Even poetry that seems to focus on very mundane experiences, modern, urban experiences, whatever it may be, where it can be about relationships, it can be about work, it can be it can seem on the surface to be dealing with very concrete subjects. The fact that we recognize there's something worthy of a poem in it means we are recognizing some resonance or some illumination within that reality that we are then trying to convey through the medium of poetry. So I do think that really all poetry on some level is sacred poetry. But when I speak of sacred poetry, the sort of poetry I tend to focus on in the Poetry Chaikhana is poetry first and foremost by people that are, I would identify as mystics, which is a term, a kind of a general catch-all term I tend to prefer rather than language like, say, saint or sage, something like that. Saint, for example, can be very focused on certain types of religious traditions and less on others. Sage sometimes can convey a sense of aloofness or whatever. There's a lot of those terms are rather loaded terms. Mystic to me is a little bit more of a wide open catch-all phrase that doesn't necessarily imply anything about religion. A person could be utterly secular or atheist or whatever and still be a mystic in the deep sense. It can also say anything about any historical period. So anyway, I'm looking for people who seem to be mystics, who seem to be expressing something about their own direct experience of wide open awareness, non-dual awareness, the sacred, the divine, and they're then conveying that through the medium of poetry. And so that's what I'm looking at with sacred poetry in particular, not even what a lot of people might label as religious or devotional poetry. That's not really what I'm as interested in. You know, there's a lot of very good devotional poetry, a lot of not so very good devotional poetry out there, but I'm not as interested in the poetry that is about, you know, the sacred search, that is about love for God or you know, our ideas about insight and awakening. I'm looking for the poetry that is an expression of insight and awakening and true seeing in some sense or other. So some of that is contemporary poetry that I look at, people that you wouldn't necessarily identify as being religious or even mystical in the common sense of the phrase, but they're expressing something about deep awareness. But then other times I'm genuinely looking at some of the traditional saints and revered figures of various religious traditions, and I'll work with everything from a lot of the medieval Catholic saints to, you know, of course, Buddhists and Sufi poets and poets all over the world, really. So that's what I'm usually referring to as sacred poetry, as opposed to the sacred that we find in all forms of poetry. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded of a response, but that's a big part of what I'm particularly interested in. But you were asking about a poem, and we should jump into a poem. This is on page 152 of The Longing in Between. And this is a poem by Mahmud Shabistari, who was a Persian Sufi poet and a really loved figure of among Persian Sufis. And this is an excerpt of a poem of his that I thought might be appropriate in honor of this interview, because he does to me suggest something of the relationship of duality and multiplicity with the non-dual awareness of the mystic's deep insight and awareness. And this is called I and You. I and you are but the lattices in the niches of a lamp, through which the one light shines. I and you are the veil between heaven and earth. Lift this veil and you will see no longer the bond of sects and creeds. When I and you do not exist, what is mosque? What is synagogue? What is the temple of fire? I love that opening segment. I and you are but the lattices in the niches of a lamp, through which the one light shines. To me, that in a very simple visual metaphor gives us an understanding of how we can understand the perception of multiplicity, duality, separation that makes up most of our daily awareness, but how behind that there is just a singular reality, a non-dual state of existence. I get into this a little bit in the commentary I use to accompany this poem. He gives us this image of a lamp with a lattice work around it. And so what it's doing is it's taking that single light and dividing it into multiple shafts of light. And so when we're looking outward away from the lamp, we just see those many individual shafts of light, and they might like hit and pattern against a wall, and we see multiplicity. And it's only when we have the idea of turning around and looking back at the source, turning inward, if you want to say it that way, that we realize there really is just the one light. All that perception of the multiplicity is simply that lattice work dividing it out, but it's not dividing it into multiple lights. It's still just a single light that has divided itself up into shafts of light. And then, if we wanted to, all we have to do is remove that lattice work, and we just see the single light shining everywhere. And you can also say that the light itself hasn't changed its nature. It's simply doing what it does, which is to shine in its singular radiance. But when we apply that lattice work over it, we then see it as a multiplicity. So it's part of a continuum. It's not that you have separation and you're trying to find that unity or non-dual truth. It's that it's all part of a continuum, and it really depends on where we are turning our attention at that moment, so that we get those great lines in the beginning. I and you are but the lattices in the niches of a lamp through which the one light shines.
This just exemplifies really the beauty of the book, and it expands it because we get to hear you speaking and hear you reading. And, you read beautifully.
Oh, thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
You're better than Coleman Barks.
Well, don't tell Coleman Barks that. I've had the good fortune to hear Coleman Barks speak a couple of times, and he really is wonderful to hear. If you've ever heard him, with that his wonderful kind of slow Southern drawl, it's really a pleasure to listen to him. But I certainly will take the compliment as well. Thanks.
I haven't seen him in person, but I've watched videos. Something else I like about your book, and when you talked about a little bit at the background of the author, I'm not going to try to repeat his name, of that poem. It reminded me that in the back of your book you have these mini biographies of every poet.
Of Shabistari, yes. Part of the reason I wanted to do this book as a general anthology was there are in America, they say right now that Rumi is one of the most widely read poets and widely known poets in the West. And I think that's wonderful. And people also know the great work of Kabir and a few others. But beyond maybe 3 or 4 well-known historical sacred poets, we start to struggle to think of poems popularly or poets. And there's really just an amazing, rich heritage. Hundreds of poets, thousands of poets from various religious and spiritual traditions. And I really wanted to find a way to bring many more of these amazing voices to the general awareness and to inspire conversation and exploration and more searching.
Where do you discover all these authors?
I went through a period when I was first thinking up the idea of doing something like what became the Poetry Chaikhana, and I just was suddenly fired up. It was like a pilot light just burst into full flame inside me. And it was really when I first discovered a few poets that I hadn't ever heard of before outside of those handful of well-known poets. And I thought, this is amazing. Like, one was a Sufi poet, Abu Sa'id Abil Khair, who was an early Sufi poet, someone I had never heard of. I know he's a mouthful for most of us in the West to even pronounce his name, but I just loved it. And I came across, say, the poetry of Ram Prasad from India, the great Kali devotee, and I just realized there is some amazing stuff out there, and why don't I know about this? So I started tracking it down wherever I could find it. I would buy any anthology that looked like it might have some interesting poets in it. I would find books in used bookstores. And this was a little bit earlier in the internet, but you are starting to be able to find books on the internet more. And it just became a passion for several years in particular. And I just started gathering it together wherever I could find it and thinking about how to share it more widely and how to introduce more people to that work.
You love poetry, and you write your own poetry.
I do, yes. I've had one collection of my poetry published called Real Thirst, and that was published, I believe, 4 years ago. And I was pleased with that. But most of my focus is with the poetry of these other poets and trying to share my own thoughts and commentary about it. A lot of the way I got into this work was through my own poetry, where I started on my own journey, having these experiences of opening. And at first I was trying to journal about it a bit, and I realized what really wanted to come out of me was poetry. So I just started writing poetry, and a number of metaphors just started coming out very naturally. And at the same time, I was starting to read a little bit more of other people's sacred poetry, some of the great classics. And I realized that some of the metaphors that I was using spontaneously were used in very similar ways by these other poets. And I began to come up with this idea that a lot of the metaphorical language that occurs in sacred poetry it's not just pretty language. It's not just beautiful, poetic word games. That there's really something very specific being conveyed, and sometimes very precise on a technical, spiritual level, if that makes sense. Yet, there isn't a lot of discussion or thought going on in public arenas about what is really being said with this poetry. Just as one example, a lot of your listeners will, of course, be familiar with the idea of the Kundalini, the rising of the Kundalini that's explored in many forms of yoga. And it's often described as this energy or force that can rise up, and it can burn away a lot of the sense of, for want of a better term, the sense of ego or the personal or little self. And so you get this fiery, rising, consuming, but cleansing energy, and also a sense of loss of self, of the little self. And that's one of the reasons in sacred language, both within sacred poetry and other expressions of sacred language, we get discussion often of the moth gleefully going into the fire and allowing itself to be consumed because the moth is in love with the fire. One way to understand that sort of natural metaphor is that it's a discussion or expression of what is experienced with the rising of the Kundalini coupled with the loss of an ego self. And there's several other metaphors. One that I particularly like and have used in some of my own poetry a lot is the metaphor of the full moon. This is used in all different world traditions, but it's especially emphasized often in Buddhist language and Buddhist poetry of the East. And the moon can, because often in these states of ecstatic opening, there's often a sense of an all-permeating radiance. While it can be permeating everything, there's also a sense of it somehow being gentle and just resting upon everyone and everything that's perceived. It's like there's a glow within everything. And so often you'll find this language coming up in sacred poetry of the full moon on a peaceful night, just illuminating the night landscape. And so this is the sort of language that I just love to discover in poetry. And a lot of it was already kind of coming out in my own poetry because I just wasn't finding satisfactory descriptive prose ways of exploring it.
Can I read a poem?
Absolutely. I'd love to hear one.
This is by Issa. Am I pronouncing his name?
Yes, I believe so. Kobayashi Issa. Yeah.
Mountains mirrored in his eye. Dragonfly.
Mm. That's a real favorite of mine too. And it's interesting. I've become a real fan of haiku. I've always loved it, but in recent years, it's just really spoken to me.
Can you read that? I'd like to hear you read that.
Absolutely. Sometimes what I'll do is with the shorter poems is I'll read them twice or even 3 times to just let them settle in the listener's ear. Mountains, mountains, mirrored in his eye, dragonfly. Mountains, mirrored in his eye, dragonfly. This is just, to me, one of those wonderful haiku. Haiku have this magical quality of taking just an instant in nature, or not even a complete thought or observation, just like a fragment, and you get this, it just kind of unpacks and unfolds, and it just suggests so many things to the more you kind of think it and run it through your head. Like this one, mountains mirrored in his eye, dragonfly. You get so many elements playing out. First of all, if you just follow the lines of the haiku, it's like you can see the frame moving in tighter with each line. So first you have mountains. I live here in Colorado at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. So every day I get this amazing panorama of the Rocky Mountains, and I have a sense of their immensity. And they really kind of, in their quiet way, dominate the psychology of everyone who lives here. And so you get this immense, stable image of these mountains. And very quickly that frame pulls in tighter, and you realize that the mountains are actually mirrored in someone's eye. It's a reflection of the mountains. And then it pulls in as tight as you can get when you realize that the eye it's reflected in is a dragonfly. And to me, dragonflies have a particularly interesting quality as they come up in poetry. It's a common animal to appear in especially a lot of Japanese haiku, where I'm not sure it's fair to say that these poets intend the firefly to represent A, B, or C, but they tend to use them in a way that suggests something about the meditator's mind. Because if you think about a dragonfly for a moment, they're so delicate. If you picture a dragonfly on a warm summer's day, the way it darts around in the air, it's ephemeral, it's intangible, it's seemingly impossible to catch, like the normal mind during its busy, frantic activity, jumping this way and that, and never quite still. But then all of a sudden that dragonfly will just come to a halt mid-air, where it's just hovering there. And it's so still, even though it's flying still. It's just so perfectly still. And it's like the mind when it comes to rest in deep meditation. And when that mind comes to rest, it then becomes capable of true reflection, of reflecting something that's much more immense than its own small and tangible nature would seem capable of. And so in this case, we can see this intangible little dragonfly reflecting the massive immensity of mountains. And that might suggest the same way that the meditator's mind, when it suddenly comes to stillness, becomes capable of reflecting the immensity of the greater reality, of the whole reality, undivided. So we get this wonderful, very short haiku. Mountains, mountains mirrored in his eye. Dragonfly. By Kobayashi Issa.